Alright, welcome back to Deep Thoughts. Today we're going to discuss something that I'm going to call the technology of the mind. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of getting us there, because I think that we have forgotten that there is technology for the mind. So there's all this history that goes back, and you will hear people talk about it all the time. And they'll be discussing how various regimes in history, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Spanish, all these forces, had developed technology to enslave the people of their time. And man, in general, always focuses on the physical. You know, walls around a city, legions of soldiers that could simply keep you in a particular area to tax you and all this stuff, right? But let me ask you this. Let's do a little analogy here. You got a backyard like the one I'm sitting in right now. You buy a brand new puppy dog. It's one of these kind of species that just within a day or two, it's nearly full grown, but it's still just a bumbling idiot puppy dog who's trying to have fun with life. I mean, this dog that we get, it's trying to dig holes. It's trying to get out of the backyard. It's trying to find, it's trying to dig holes underneath the fence. It's just doing anything to kind of get out of this constraining area. And so the only thing that we can do, if all we believe in is physical technology, is to put a bigger fence up, line the ground with concrete so it only digs down 6 inches and it runs into a barrier. We might come up with a shock collar. It's always technology. The whole yard turns into a really strange mess. The dog itself is tethered and strapped down and all this other crap, right? And then you just happen to be having some guests over, and you make some small talk about your dog dilemma in the backyard, and one person goes, "Well, I'm a dog trainer." "Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is a very common thing they tell you." Give me just like a week with your dog. And you agree, and they come here every day, and they train the dog for a couple hours a day. And all of a sudden, the dog no longer wants to leave the backyard. It no longer wants to dig holes. It's chill. It's relaxed. In fact, now it just, poops in one corner, sleeps in another, sniffs the flowers. It's the cutest, amazing thing. And you have 10 commands you can give the dog to sit up, roll over, play dead, shake hands, etc., etc. What's really funny is you just heard that story and you probably had a ping of boredom because it's such a basic story that you've heard before. It's such a basic concept to understand. But isn't it funny that I would say 95% of folks in the average third world history never contemplate that we are the puppy dog in history. And all we ever focus on in this historical recollection of our past are the physical technologies used to control us or control each other. We study, the birth of weapons, the birth of, naval ships that have weapons on them. Then we took to the air. Then we took to space. We don't think about how the brain has been controlled and how utterly profitable it is, right? Now, what's really interesting is, and I'm going to try not to repeat myself in this episode from previous episodes because I've been doing a lot of that lately. The amount of folks where I live in Southern California who are sort of taking their religion, which is Christianity in most cases, and they're kind of going from, I never talk about being religious, to talking about it as a mechanism to survive. They look out into the world and see some of the stuff reported on the news, and they are trying to come back and combat what they see with their religion. And this whole thing about the end times sort of vibe that's going around inside things, end time is sort of this interesting thing that happens where people believe they've got, the general guidelines on how to live, but they look at society and they can't understand it anymore, and it looks hopeless. It looks hopeless, and it's sort of a precursor to almost a suicidal feeling, I think. They're sort of wishing for the end times because at least they don't have to blow their own brains out. Well, God, why don't you come down and take us out? Whatever happens, I know I've got your ear, and I know I'm not going to be in hell. So just come down and clean out all these folks. Yes, I know my spouse might go down deep, but so be it. And so the interesting thing is I've got folks that come in now, and I've been in this particular location for 14 years straight. And of course I've changed friends, changed methods of, hanging out with friends because venues come and go here and there. But I haven't noticed in my entire 14-year stay here someone coming up to me and really trying to convert me and everyone else in the room in the vein of saving our souls because some end times are coming. Now, it is endearing that someone would care enough about humanity in some form or fashion, either guided or misguided, to want to convert people to their religion to make sure that they have someone to hang out with in their perceived heaven, right? But what they are doing is bringing you a mental technology to save your life. And what's further ironic and ancestral about the formula is that here they are bringing me a religion called Christianity. And again, I apologize to those of you who disagree with this assessment. But what the Romans did was, in just a crude analogy, they ruled for close to 1,000 years, okay, prior to Christ. I mean, you can contest and look at the tribes and how they all put it together, but good 500 years, right? But they used technology mainly to rule up to the point of like Christ's fabled existence, right? And just before Christ was, rumored to have been born, never recorded in history, but rumored, Titus Flavius, who was running the show at the time, and the Flavius family, which was essentially the Rothschilds of Rome. They're not necessarily related. I have no idea if they're related, but he invented something called the Colosseum. Just look up the Colosseum in Wikipedia, and you'll see Titus Flavius's name in there. Is started bringing the grandfather of the whole concept. But as most of you know, the Colosseum was used to, conduct entertainment inside this building, such that people would pay to get in, or at least get in, and they would be so focused on what was going on there that they would not pay attention to the leadership of Rome. So as the leadership of Rome floundered and, had ups and downs, he created the distraction. The distraction is what? The Colosseum in itself is definitely a physical construct, right? You've got to put, and the funny thing is it's pretty damn small when you really think about the giant population that's supposed to be in that time frame. But there's other gigantic arenas and things that they put together. But what that physical object did was allow him to create a technology inside the mind of man that swayed people away from paying attention to him. And there's something utterly brilliant about that if you really want to think it through. Because up to that point, I'm sure it had been done several times, but there was a bit of a, wow, has anyone ever done this before, Titus Flavius? Surely the answer is yes, right? But they were just getting started is the absolute interesting thing. And if you were to take the history of Rome and look at their inventions over time that were physical methods of control, to hold the place together, forming legions, forming better weapons, and going through the Bronze Age, and outfitting them with stuff that allowed them to just roll over most countries in the world. Alexander the Great had a good time for a while there. Eventually, it all crescendoed into Christianity. Someone who really thought this thing through and said, well, this mental apparatus of controlling people is penniless once we deploy it. And we essentially gain control over time for a really long time, as long as we can keep the mental chains on people's minds, right? And we had a sort of a... he's a regular, but he comes in about once every quarter. Came through the lounge the other day, the smoke lounge, and he's the one that shook this out of me. But he was talking about the technology to control man, but all he was talking about is the physical technology. And he wants to go back to the story of Christ. He was coming in very heavy about the Anunnaki, which is kind of funny. I will do an episode about that. I'm starting to develop the angles that I think are going to make it really interesting. But let me just give you a little bit of my background with sort of this era. So when I was in high school, one of the classes I had to take, or just took, was sort of an advanced writing class, but it was also sort of loosely connected to history, where you would come in the door, and they make you buy 5x7 cards, and you had to pick a moment in history and write about it pretty much the whole semester. And you had to write a certain number of cards before you were able to, be approved to keep going. And it was just sitting, reading, and writing. And it was really one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life, because the teacher wasn't up my ass. He just said, read about the era that you pick out and go for it. And mine was sort of it was mainly the Middle Ages, but I was smart enough to go back in time and track up to the Middle Ages and start to see the Inquisitions. And so I did a big giant pass for, I guess, 6 months, roughly. Probably not quite 6, but whatever half a year is in high school, where you actually have a summer. And then as I became an adult, I bought several books on the Inquisitions over time. And it was always one of these things of, okay, so this happened, right? The church went around in various regions and kept this Inquisition thing going for roughly about 800 years. And when you read about that stuff at face value, your whole thing is, okay, this happened, and what a bummer for these people. And then you get older and you start to kind of read between the lines. You start to understand, what was this thing and how could it possibly have gone so long? The British did their version, the Spanish did their version, sort of the Middle Europe, which was pretty nebulous at the time, did their version. It just kept going and going and going. And it was almost like selling Amway. There was something that was beneficial to the country that was expending, what would probably be today billions of dollars worth of money and treasure and time to get people and to force people to believe something. I mean, think about it today. Think about some, 800-year cycle, nearly a millennia, right? Where people are going to, America for, say, 300 years is going to run around pounding into people's heads that, Microsoft makes the best operating system, Google's the best search engine, Fox is the best news, Now, the other thing to remember is a generation back in that day and age went very quickly. Girls were having babies, between the age of 14 and 18 on average. So 100 years of indoctrination of any kind is really cranking out a tremendous amount of generations, right? It's approximately 7 generations. That's a lot per 100 years. And so over time, now what also blows my mind is that they would feel the need to continue after 7 generations, which would be 100 years roughly. Obviously, people were rejecting this story of Christ because they were there and they didn't see anything, and they know this whole thing was bullshit. Don't mean to offend, but I think that's the truth. There's there's a reason why I had to go, nearly 1,000 years before everyone just said, all right, you and your fucking story, whatever. Here's my 10%. Because if it's the truth, well, they're just going to walk right in. Well, of course. You don't need to tell me twice. The guy that I saw walk on water, yeah, he's the Son of God. Don't need to pound it in me for 800 years. But if it didn't happen, well, that's what you got to do. What they did was they installed a mental technology inside their people, which we call in this day and age indoctrination, propaganda. In so many words, mental manipulation of the mind. And you wonder why you wonder why maybe you personally struggle in questioning this data. It is so pounded into the genetics, depending on your lineage or where you come from, that you believe down to your core. Now, it should be noted that the overall algorithm of the rising of the sun, the death of the sun, and the resurrection of the sun is a typology of how we see the sun come up every day. Right? At night, it's scary. There's very little information. You can get eaten by predators. When the sun comes up, it's warm. It's providing visual information. Now you can figure out where you are and what you want to do with your eyeballs. It goes over now. If you're being plagued by predators at night, and there's nothing you can do to stop the sun from going down. You can't talk to the guy and say, could you please stay up an extra day or so because we're trying to finish up this hut here to protect ourselves from the animals. He goes down. And because you do not know where you are in the universe, regardless of what model you might adhere to, its death is scary and its resurrection is euphoric. And so the birth, death, and resurrection formula came out of the cycle of the sun. And again, just like Dr. Outwell talks about, typology is the retelling of a story to be more fanciful and amazing than the original, but adhering to the overall structure of the first story. And that is where you get all birth, death, and resurrection storylines all throughout history. So as I've always said, just to recap in a couple sentences here, Rome was about to fall at 0 AD. It was. Gotten too big for its britches. It didn't have enough physical human beings to physically create the technology to stop people from not giving taxes, from not following what Caesar said. So they needed a mental virus that would spread throughout all the people. And that's where you get Christianity. Again, at the time that it was created, it was the 23rd version of that parable. The story of Cuchulainn in Ireland, the story of Horus and Isis, the story of Tamos and Nimrod. Tamos is the child. Ishtar and Nimrod, or Semiramis and Nimrod. And there's just dozens of others, right? So that was the last giant push of Rome to save its own skin. And it worked. They got a tremendous extension on their life. And of course, but just like NASA is doing right now, where they're creating these side companies like SpaceX to fake everything that they've been faking for years, but then to kind of, siphon off the liability of the fake. Rome siphoned everything off into a church, which very slowly and painfully and meticulously created traditions that were then interwoven into those that capitulated during the Inquisition. Because think about it, once you were approached by the Inquisition, formally speaking, and you could get yourself cleared, yes, I totally believe this Christianity thing, which needs to be pounded in your head because it's so true. You pop out and they'll say, okay, we'll go through the orange door right there, the little Masonic 33 door, and go learn what you need to do to stay in our good graces. And this is where you find out that the Bible's written in Latin and you don't speak Latin because they don't teach it. You could barely speak the language that you speak. You certainly struggle to write your name down at this point because it's simply not important for us to read and write, to exist. Because man back in that era just communicated and bartered and so on and so forth, right? And tradition is interesting because tradition gets rid of one of the worries, which is, am I doing it right? Am I doing what I need to do correctly? And so you're going into your brain, the mental technology, to satiate yourself as to whether or not you're going to be saved. It's a big deal when it becomes effortless to do things perfect in your own mind. Say this prayer when you wake up, say this prayer when you go to bed, say this prayer before you eat, say this other prayer before you eat, right? My grandfather was Catholic, and he said 2 prayers before every single meal. And like I think I've said before, it was the most discompassionate thing you've ever seen. It was a guy doing a check on a piece of paper with absolutely zero emotion, zero godlike presence when he would say these things. He was a very God-fearing man, but it was pointless, in my opinion, for him to say anything at the dinner table because it was disingenuous to God. But then the people behaved, and they got them under their Christian thumb, for the most part. And there was a big exhale in Europe as the Inquisitions peeled off. They had a methodology. Cultures were starting to divide up beautifully. The infinite battles of Europe were starting to calm down. If you've ever seen the time-lapse time-lapse simulation of where country borders moved throughout the years, you have Poland growing almost as big as Europe and then slamming back down to a tiny little postage stamp on the ground and then swelling back up again a little bit. Germany's all over the place. Every country has been big and small all over Europe, right? Once all that calmed down, they had individuals that lived in their little villages, their little towns, a couple things we might even classify remotely as a city. But they were living fairly independent lives, and the only thing that had been pushed into their brain is that you must give on to Caesar, which is now turned into the Catholic Church and the Vatican, and their own little sovereign land down there, right? They knew about maritime law, and so they created a legal sort of sanctuary for themselves that no one can tell them what to do because they are their own land. But now they had a bit of a problem because things were settling down and people were starting to become, they were able to kind of skirt the obligations of Sunday morning mass and giving out their 10% to the church. They were content with the sort of the rule of law set down by their indigenous country laws, but also by the church. And again, you have to understand that the Vatican had every single country up until Henry VIII by the balls. You mess with the Pope, you were fucked. He was going to start, because he's a godlike creature, he would start a war against you, a crusade against you, and quite frankly, nobody really messed with the church until Henry VIII. But you have this sort of balkanized Europe, right? It's cut into different countries. And you have people kind of willy-nilly living their lives. If any of you have seen the Monty Python movie, Quest for the Holy Grail, there's a hilarious scene where Graham Chapman stumbles upon Michael Palin playing a old woman. I think it's Michael. Yeah. And he's stacking mud. That's his life. He just stacks mud. And he, Graham Chapman is playing King Arthur, and he says, basically, take me to your king. And he says, we don't have a king. He says, what do you mean you don't have a king? And he goes into this beautiful dialogue, the hilarious sort of who's on first dialogue about how they don't have a king, they have elections and all this other stuff, which is going to, obviously he was mocking today, taking it back to that era of, I think it's 992 year AD. And that's sort of how, what Michael Palin was playing, just a random character working on a farm stacking mud. I want you to think of Europe being essentially fairly free. Yes, they had the technology of Christianity inserted into their brain through essentially 800 years of terror, And then the country said, well, we're having a problem here making sure that my citizens in my boundary of government, borders are loyal to me, and yours aren't loyal to you, and they should be loyal to you. Imagine, this is a fictitious recreation here, but imagine the leaders of Germany talking to the leaders of France, and they both kind of agree there's this willy-nilly honoring of the borders. Yeah, most people speak this French language over here, and these other people speak Deutsch. But there wasn't like this, I am German and I feel completely German and I'm loyal to whatever the leadership of Germany has, and France didn't have the same thing. So all these countries kind of were loosely defined, right? And this is where we have the invention of something called Prussian education. It's like Russian with a P on the front. Prussian. Now, with everything devious in the world, it is brilliant at the same exact time. It's devious as hell. And so, some people might view, if you're unwilling to look at the benefits of Christianity, you could simply just look at Christianity and say, what an evil, evil construct it is. Now, it is used to create evil situations, but in it itself is just a story with some great passages in it, according to me, right? For instance, if you look at the fact that Old Testament preached eye for an eye, what does that mean? Well, you fuck with somebody, they can fuck with you. It's the law. It's the law. You rape someone's wife, well, I don't know how that works, but technically speaking, you should be able to rape his wife. He plucks you out your eye, you can pluck out his eye. In fact, you don't even have to do it. The people will do it on your behalf. They just verify you lost your left eye, and they got this guy, pin him down, and knock out his eye. To be literal, right? But how did it change once Christianity came around? When Caesar didn't want anyone fighting back, especially with the blessing of the Bible. But remember, the Old Testament was sort of, they didn't have Old Testament books that people carried around with them, as far as I know, back in the day. They just knew the stories. But it went from eye for an eye to turn the other cheek, which means take an ass beating indefinitely. Well, what does that do? That allows one guy, instead of a legion, to control a whole town, a tax collector, right? Well, that makes Caesar and Rome and the Vatican and all their mercenaries that they hired, the Blackwater mercenaries that they hired, infinitely powerful over anyone who believes that doctrine. Now, in reality, probably no one really turned the other cheek indefinitely, right? A couple hippies in town until they got their faces knocked off, and then they either perished while the guys with balls kicked the shit out of the guys that were roughing up people. But the Prussian education system was and is diabolically systemic to mankind, and we live in it right now. There's a whole doctrine of which I do not have memorized, but there's a doctrine that was written down as the objectives of a Prussian education. And you should go look it up if you're interested. It's actually essential. It's very basic to understand, which is essentially that you are to work in capacities within your country to serve the government, to serve the country itself, be it industry or industrial jobs that might build tanks and roads and what have you, to serving in the military, which is more the functional charter of this Prussian education system. But the big one is to obey and believe without essentially the ability to question anything, your leadership of your country. For those of you who watch the amazing British series Downton Abbey, you will have seen this transformation right before your very eyes from the very first episode to the last episode, where the servants in the first season were just serfs. They were docile to their leadership. They never asked any questions. They did what they were told. Very kind of sub-microcosm of Prussian existence. Then, as the series progressed to the very end, they were dismantling this sort of the rich of Europe, and the people started to speak up. Remember, I forgot the girl's name, but the girl who was the assistant to the chef, she got really lippy at the end. You had the school teacher who had the hots for the chauffeur guy, and she was very lippy. And they essentially broke out of their Prussian thinking process. So now you guys are either on board with what I'm saying, or you're still asking questions and going, what the hell are you talking about? Now, I've been thinking about this whole EU thing, the whole sort of Muslim invasion of Europe. And the unfortunate thing that sort of is a blowback of making any comments about this is it seems as if anyone who disapproves of the migration of non-Syrian, forged passports of individuals moving into Europe without any employable skills, with a system of law that is 2,000 to 3,000 years old in terms of thinking. It's not really that old in terms of its foundation. Is that it makes the Arabs look bad. And there's obviously the majority of Arabs are just minding their own business in their own indigenous area. There's just a small influx of folks coming into Europe. And then it sort of paints Europeans as being really stupid people who are allowing this to happen to their countries. It's more complex than that on virtually every single level. And the individuals like George Soros and Merkel and Macron and all these people who are, consistently providing sexual favors for their leadership in one way or another to view it. They're the ones making all this happen, and they understand the complexities, the mental complexities of this issue, such that someone with a little bit of empathy and a little bit of education will get stuck in these conversations. And you're kind of like you're trying to be empathetic towards someone else's suffering, even though the suffering is sort of faux suffering or self-inflicted suffering because no one's willing to get a job beyond stacking mud, right? But the reason why the EU is even possible to create is because of the Prussian education system, and it's probably, I would say, damn near 1,000-year reign over the European mindset. If you really want to know who an American is, and I'll say we are a very, very special breed of human being, let me tell you, it's that we were the folks that were in Europe who said, go fuck yourself. We are the gene that listened to the Prussian education system, and we saw it for what it was. We're the folks that looked at the repression of monarchs on the people. The stamp tax of England, where every single piece of paper that you owned had to be stamped by the Queen, which gave her the right, or him the right, to invade the privacy of your own home, to inspect, to make sure that every piece of paper you had a stamp on it. It was just an excuse. It was a ludicrous idea that ignorant people at the time bought into. But the founding fathers of this country, who are often called terrorists, are only terrorists to terrorists. We fought fire with fire, and that's why we exist. And that is why America is under constant attack from the EU, from the banking community in Europe. And that's why it was very, very important that Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders did not become president, because they are absolutely a part of a political regime that survives on the Prussian educational system. Now, I've seen personally horrific shit on video in Europe conducted by, these migrants. I've read articles and seen photographs of people that, women that have been raped, gang raped. Read articles about 13-year-old girls being kidnapped and raped. And you're looking at it going, okay, this is all happening, unfortunately a lot of it happens in Germany, at least the stuff that gets reported. And you sit and you think from an American standpoint, with our minds that say, don't let anyone fuck with you, man. Right? What the hell's wrong with you? That you would let anyone to even threaten your family. Right? I mean, it's one of these things of, I think most Americans, especially where I live, if somebody walked next door to a family with a father, a mother, and children, and some punk-ass immigrant came there and stumbled through English and said, I'm going to get your kids because they have to go to school. They have to walk outside. I'm going to grab them and I'm going to do all these Sharia law things to them. Nothing would stop that father from killing that person as quickly as possible in America. And they're not going to worry about whether or not it's legal. They're going to eradicate that gene from this country. And that's what we're doing. We're taking all these gangsters and all these crazy immigrants and moving them the fuck out of here, back to where they come from. Let their country deal with them, right? But you wonder, as an American, how does a European citizen allow this to occur? Now, if you ask the European citizen, and I have heard several business partners of mine who have gone over there recently, and then literally in the last quarter, this is August right now, and they got stuck in conversations that they felt were very uncomfortable, where people were hating on America, and they were feeling so goddamn righteous about letting in all these folks that are fucking destroying their country, right? And they believe that they have achieved some superior enlightenment. And what's really funny about that is being in America, we have blowhards from Europe, and again, it's just a tiny group of folks that believe this way. So again, I'm not trying to insult or categorize or generalize European citizens, because I believe that they're overall fed up with this bullshit. They're just trying to figure out how to get around their docile nature to respond. But we have art galleries here every once in a while, especially in San Francisco, where you'll be looking at a whole room full of absolute bullshit, right? Like, it'll be like a box of matches on a fucking pedestal, and someone's going to try to tell you how existential the box of matches are, you know. Did you notice that one of them was blue and all the rest of them were red? You know what that means, right? That's the individual pushing through a Nemo construct and blah, 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 right? There's nothing more, I think, damning and destructive to the human mind than to bullshit yourself that you're intellectual when you're not. And I think that this small group of, I would say, individuals, whether they be wealthy or not, who are trying to pacify and make right an absolute, emperor not having any clothes on and marching right down Main Street, they are the demise of their own race. They're the demise of their own culture. And it's super sad. But the reason why they're able to get into this mindset and get into that conversation is because they have been the absolute victims of an educational system that breeds people that obey. People wonder how Hitler rose up and was able to get an entire country to follow him. And regardless if you want to debate what you think he did or what he didn't do and who built him up and all this other stuff, he was still able to get these giant groups of folks together and fight. And it was because he inherited probably at least 600 years worth of Prussian education on his people. And again, it was all the other Prussian education systems that allowed the other countries to fight back and get him. So what is the status of the world today? It's pretty apparent that all the countries that are part of the EU, who want to remain a part of the EU, who will make excuses for Merkel and the EU, they are suffering a sort of level 10 indoctrination of Prussian education. They will go down with the ship, taking their race with them, all the time claiming that they are the intellectual superior to the world. It's almost as if self-loathing is the final grand achievement of intellectual enlightenment for humanity. And Americans disagree wholeheartedly. What happened in America, though? Does America have the Prussian education system? Oh, yeah. But it's not as old as it is in Europe. I mention her every once in a while, but now this will perfectly dovetail with his subject matter. But there's a woman named Charlotte Iserby. Now, if you don't want to try and spell that out, because I certainly can't remember how her name is spelled, look up the book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. It's a huge book, physically, when you hold it in your hand. It's about maybe like an inch thick, but it's like a big page. I have a copy of it in the house here. Now, Charlotte Iserby was the daughter of a Skull and Bones member, which she is very upfront about. She, as many kids who are raised underneath a roof where someone might be a Masonic member or some career politician, you get about a 50-50 chance that your kid's going to go along with the parents' indoctrination. She didn't. But she was in the educational network of New England in the early 70s. And in her book, she talks about in the early 70s, I want to say 73 or so was about the time she was talking about this. But she said that a delegation from Europe came over here and essentially laid out the entire plan for enslaving America into a Prussian education system. And you might think it's just redoing the scholarly books and the subject matter and the classes that were available. That was definitely a big part of it. But this plan was more diabolical and more three-dimensional than anyone could have imagined. They wanted to dismantle the very functional model of townships. Again, I always go on and on about how I'm from a little town. Well, what happened to my little town in the last 20 years is essentially the final schematics of what she's talking about in her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Now, my little hometown, it's a township. It's a 6-mile square. Not all of it is a town. Actually, a lot of it has a good amount of country in it. But what my town was built as, educational-wise, was that the grade schools, there's probably about 6 grade schools, and they were distributed evenly around the town. So kids could walk to school, and parents didn't have to worry about it. Of course, in a small town, we don't have a lot of crazies and boy touchers and that kind of stuff, and kidnappers. We had one central school downtown on Main Street that was the junior high, which when I went to school was 7, 8, and 9th grade. And east of town, we had a high school. So it wasn't quite centralized, but it was built in, I think, 1914 or something like that. And it was a 3-story brownstone, beautiful school. And, some kids had to get bused there, but a lot of kids could at that point drive, because in the Midwest at 14 you can drive, especially to school. And the reason why it's 14 is that the farmers lobbied the state to say, look, my child needs to have the ability to drive around the farm. And so to make one blanket policy, all kids at 14 got to drive. And at 16 you get your full license. So Charlotte Iserby's plan was, they said, all the schools have to be combined into a single school. Where possible, those schools need to be remotely located outside of the town to create stress on the population itself to truck the kids to and from school. Now, let's face it, in the Midwest, you don't make a lot of money like you make in the coastal regions where there's ample jobs of all walks of life. And so not every family in the Midwest is capable of giving their child a car with insurance, with gas, with repairs. Again, you're going to probably give your kid a shitty old car. It's going to have problems, and you're going to be throwing money into the car just to keep it running. Even if you have an older child that can take the younger children to school, it gets complicated, it gets expensive. In the last 15 years, my hometown took every grade school and shut it down and built one grade school, which looks like a communist concentration camp on the, I think it's like the north side of town, or the west side of town. It's ugly. It's miles away from most of the homes in town. They took the high school, which had just been retrofitted about 20 years ago, completely rebuilt inside, it was gorgeous, and built a new school 5 miles outside of town. Depending on what side of the town you're on. If you're on the very edge of town, it's probably a couple miles outside of town. But it's way outside of town. It's a neat school. They built a nice building, single-story building, which is nice. Big, field for the kids, all that kind of stuff. Very modern. And they tore the new school, or the old school, down to the ground. But it goes further than that. Charlotte Iserby talked about the fact that they had planned to move corporations into small towns to bleed them dry. Now, if you have, say, 4 or 5 grocery stores in a particular town, like my town had when I was a kid, the money goes into a local residence cash register, He then takes that money and pays his bills to whomever, the bank, to whatever other stores that they might shop at. And the money stays in the town's ecosystem. There's a finite amount of cash that just goes in circles and pays all the bills, right? Aside from state taxes. That's the only thing that would go outside, or sales tax or something like that, right? But Walmart moved in about 1975, and it was a big, the big cover story was Sam Walton buys only American products, what have you. Now, regardless of him being a big, American, it did take the cash, put it into a corporation, and it moved out of state, right? So now all of a sudden you have a siphon going outside the state. Boom, boom, boom. Now, the restaurants in the hometown were probably about 80% personal restaurants, 20% chains. We had a Dairy Queen, we had a Hardee's, which then turned into an Arby's, which then went out of business. We had a Sonic. We eventually got a McDonald's when I was in high school. But one by one, the personal restaurants got replaced by commercial corporate restaurants with, again, horrible Cisco food ingredients, right? When GMOs took over, well, those Cisco trucks are all full of GMOs now. We all know what McDonald's food's made out of, right? The CEO of that company, along with Kentucky Fried Chicken CEO, which we also have one of those, both said they would never eat their own food. The McDonald's CEO says, look, I'm not even a restaurant company. I'm a real estate company. McDonald's is in the real estate business. And he's right. Every Midwest town in every single Midwest state struggled to talk Walmart into bringing in one of their stores. They begged McDonald's to bring it in. Why? Well, but the television said that's what you need. And of course the prices go down because the quality goes down and because it's a scam. These cities now struggle where they were completely self-sufficient 40 years ago. They struggle. It's funny, on my Facebook feed, I've got some friends from my hometown, and they'll post in one post how bad it is that downtown doesn't have any businesses and how the whole town's gone to shit over the last 20, 30 years, and then they will like the Walmart page. Talk about lost in time. Their loyalties have been rebranded, moved around without any thinking, because the education, the actual courses that Charlotte Iserby talked about, were essentially rearranged from reading, writing, and arithmetic, from any of the sciences that can give you kind of the budding knowledge as to whether or not you want to be a physicist or a chemist or whatever the hell you want to be, an architect. All those classes are poo-pooed. They still exist, but they're not revered, right? We got all the ed classes, the sexual ed classes, right? It's now important to teach children to pick their orientations before they've ever had sex before. It's all mental technologies. It's to sway your loyalty, to sway and remap negative to positive and positive to negative. For any of you who are heavy Christians, you're usually looking for the devil in things. You're looking for God in things, which is another way of saying you're looking for the truth and you're looking for the lies. She laid it all out. She completely laid it all out so that we would understand. This show is about undoing all that education, all that indoctrination. It's about helping you identify within yourself how you have been enslaved through normal systems to give up all of your freedoms, to give your loyalty away like a Polaroid picture. And right now the internet is our current methodology of passing information around. Now, over the last couple of years, we know that the internet has been playing games with us. As long as you fly low enough under the radar, no one messes with you, right? But the second you start causing people to wake up, the corporations that are evil, that have perhaps slogans to the contrary, they're starting to make sure that people can't find your content. The people that subscribe to your content don't get notified. People that subscribe to your content get unsubscribed. And so it's up to us to diversify our approach, to put the message in as many bottles and throw it in as many oceans as possible, such that it's just floating with wisdom. We are in the Renaissance 2.0. If we ever have been in the past, we are there now. And this is why I feel like we need to focus on the core things that matter in life, right? We have to have the courage to reassign things in our mind that perhaps we thought were great things to be loyal to, and make sure that we're not inadvertently carrying forward mechanisms and methodologies that have enslaved us, right? Most of you have probably had the conversation about, if you're an American, about Common Core, this sort of every child left behind thing that happened during President Bush Jr.'s watch. Common Core is absolutely the sort of sixth gear of the Prussian education system here in America. It's to ensure you never really learn anything, but you can graduate. And when you graduate into the system, or out of the system, I should say, you then go right back into the system to live on this socialistic tit, which will allow them to completely control you because they get to say what you have to do in order to get the basic resources of life. There's all these epidemics that they talk about, Ebola from time to time, the Zika virus, and all this kind of stuff, right? It's all totally orchestrated stuff, whether it be real or not real. It's something that's been, released upon us, let's just say, right? And there's been a lot of due diligence from various camps to talk about if there ever was some sort of 99% virus that is killing off mankind, if they're ever able to release some weird bath salts drug into our food supply or whatever, and we're all going nuts like zombies, that for those that have missed it for whatever reason, probably out of sheer luck, we're going to have to get in government lines if society crumbles. At that point, when you're in line for a FEMA camp thing or whatever, they can assess you however they want. And based on the amount of intelligence they might have on you, they could restrict your access to things, take you into custody, put you through a tribunal, kill you, right? It's 1,000,000 to 1 odds that would ever really take place. But then again, ask anyone who went through World War II in Europe as to whether or not they ever thought that was possible. And I'm sure they will tell you no. But then it happened. The best thing in the world to get out of a fight is to never get in it in the first place. To be intelligent. To know where you're treading on thin ice. And go the other way. Turn around. Go back to the thick ice. Get your ball bearings together. Create a different plan to get across that frozen pond. To utter and complete salvation. In the recent election of 2016 here in America, you had a party that was trying to teach people that they were victims of things and trying to essentially exacerbate civil war. We got this, social justice warrior thing, which was a designation of the people, and they definitely did exist, and they probably still do exist. We got the Black Lives Matter. Got all the blacks in America that have been repressed and oppressed for years, and got them all pissed off, trying to route that anger just sort of arbitrarily at society. They've now convinced a bunch of Caucasians to hate their own race, to see themselves as a privilege. Well, they call it white privilege, right? It's a mental technology. Every single one of those movements is a mental technology movement. Full indoctrination through propaganda and through George Soros, the funding to create just enough havoc to make it seem real for a very short period of time. Right now, the press around the world is sort of a gigantic magnifying glass on a very tiny agenda, which is very powerful for the world, that is going to, it's something we're going to have to fight, and we're all fighting it on a daily basis, right? this hysteria of global warming, which you should never call climate change. They're the ones that said global warming at the beginning. Now they try to take advantage and take credit for everything bad that happens in the world, right? You know, I'm often saying in this show that you want to be the pinball flippers and bumpers and kickers. Or at least you want control over them, as you are the pinball that is getting knocked around life by these mechanisms. Some of us feel like we're mostly in control of our life. Mostly. I don't think any one of us are in complete control of our lives. Maybe a couple people that have enough wealth to pull that off are. But you know, wealth is always relative. If you think you have something of value, well, there's always something to threaten that value. But most people can get out of their house in the morning, go out and do a ritual outside the house, go to work, go to some store and come home, and you're pretty much left alone as long as you do what you're told. But now what if you walked out of your house and there's just some thugs, and they don't threaten your life, they just push you. They just come up and push you in your chest and push you from your back shoulder, make you fall down. They stand behind your car as you're trying to back out in the morning. Just being assholes, right? Well, there's a pretty clear course of action if you were to ever run into that situation, right? I don't care if you are European or American. You die a lot faster in America pulling that shit off, but we typically fight back when the physical comes at us and it's right in our face, right? But if I told you that your mind was your property and your sovereign realm of existence where you must protect your brain, you must protect what you believe, and it doesn't mean that you carry the indoctrination from childhood forward and you say, this is who I am, this is who my family's always been. Your family could have been wrong. Sweet people that they were and the good intentions that they were. But like I always say, you have to purge your brain every once in a while. Take everything that you've ever put in your brain since you can remember, and just like a hoarder trying to re-outfit their home, you take everything out of the house and you put it on the front lawn, you put tents over it, and then you have to evaluate what goes back in the house, which is your mind in this analogy. You have 3 designations of all information. It's true, it's false, and you don't know. But even just putting I don't know on something gives you a lot more power in your life than to just walk straight in and let it be true, let it be false. I don't know a tremendous amount of people that have had the courage to really take everything that they've believed since they were kids and move it outside the house of their mind and bring it back in slowly. And to really evaluate it and say, why do I believe this? Why? And if the answer comes back because someone told you so, you may want to put that in the maybe pile instead of the true pile, just for now, until you get a little more information to evaluate that information. It doesn't mean that, I will say this, if you've had a really good time with that belief system, you may be inclined to say, well, that just stays true because it's really enriched my life, blah, blah, blah. All right. But let me give you a couple examples where that might not be true. A lot of people have done drugs and alcohol. Well, it's not good for you, right? So if you just keep that experience because it was the reason why you had a good time in high school and college and after college, pretty much up till 30, you know you're going to essentially die of it. And you're probably going to shorten your lifespan by 20, 30 years if you keep hanging on to that, right? There might also be things that you believed as a kid to get you through a particular era in your life. And now you no longer need the deception to sort of trick your brain to putting up with it. Like I said in my episode about, what if you're wrong? The idea is we hang on to things because they're traditions to us. Some folks might listen to Coast to Coast AM, and the theme music that comes on at the beginning of Coast to Coast AM makes them get warm fuzzies, like, oh man, here comes another cool episode. For those of us that are Doctor Who fans, as soon as that theme music comes on, my God, we got just warm fuzzies. If you listen to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on BBC recordings, that theme song will give it to you. You know what I'm saying, right? But it's irrational. It's just fun. It just is attached to these wonderful moments. But at some point, you may stop watching those shows. You've already experienced them. They were wonderful. They enriched your life. But now you're going to move on to the next chapter. Perhaps you're going to become the writer, and you're going to become the musician. You're going to write that song. You're going to write the next episode. Giving back to society, right? What I find interesting about all religions, and this is one of the things I told the Mormons when they first came over, is I said, isn't it interesting that if I said, let's talk about the gods of Egypt, the gods of Greece, the many idols that travel through Rome, we all kind of have a big chuckle, don't we? That they're wrong. That somebody thought the sun was a bird flying across the sky. That there was an anteater-headed guy named Anubis. That Zeus existed and Athena existed and Thor existed. Isn't that funny how silly they were to believe these cartoon characters were real? And in the end, all we've done is we've taken a new cartoon character, or a series of them, take all religions in the world, take all the top dogs that you're supposed to worship and talk about and believe in and obey, and we've essentially made them more serious, right? We no longer put usually, animal heads on them. What is it? The god Shira, which is worshipped at the Hadron Collider in CERN. She has a lot of arms. That's about as far as I've seen it go. But Christ is very human-like. In fact, the epitome of his definition is to make him as human as possible. Perfect in his deeds on earth, even though for some weird reason he claimed at one point in the Bible that he wasn't perfect. I don't know where he made any mistakes according to the story. But it just simply became more believable. But again, let's just say that you hate a businessman who has taken advantage of a lot of people in his lifetime. You can't stand the guy. You can't stand his face. You can't stand his voice. But I guarantee you, regardless of how much you dislike that person, there are qualities in that person that if you knew about them, you could steal them and put them into your own character, leaving behind all of the bad stuff and the taking advantage of people and that sort of thing that you think you see in them, right? So the idea is we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater every single time. But we have to get real with what we're allowing inside of our minds. There are brands that we are loyal to, which makes no sense. People who might have been loyal to, Nike, Apple, Microsoft, Google. Why would you ever be loyal to a corporate construct? Why? Because you feel cool wearing their stuff, using their equipment? You think that there's someone sitting at a desk somewhere who's thinking about you, wherever you are in the world? Nah. They're trying to create a product that's like a fish hook in your lip, that's trying to pull you in to buy something that you do not need. Right? The first conspiracy group in the world was a marketing department. Their whole job is to sell you shit you don't need. Well, that doesn't just stop at, ridiculous possessions. It goes all the way up to the national level, well, probably your town, your city, your state, your nation, maybe your race, maybe your religion. And so we need to figure out what kind of world we want to build. And I think that's where we have a lot of work to do. There are all these dilemmas, these moral dilemmas. Imagine when they ask a politician what their opinion is on abortion. It's a setup. No matter what you say, you're going to piss off a large group of people. No matter how you say it. It's a setup. Any asshole asking the question is being an asshole. They're working for the controllers to try and tear down your credibility. Now, in closing, let's just talk about 1 second here the fact that we all are different, right? But we need to kind of come to a consensus about how to run this planet. There's sort of the don't ask, don't tell idea that says, okay, Iran, you run your country the way you want. If you want Sharia law all over your country and you're going to abuse women, well, I guess, until we kind of expand our consciousness on this planet and get the rest of the countries under wrap and agree, we're not going to bother you for a while. Right now, we have at this point of this recording, sort of this Muslim invasion of Europe. It's weird. And to correct the problem, you have to have a perception that it is a problem, and then you have to have sort of, well, what do you want it to be in the end? What are you trying to do? With the EU charter, you no longer have really nation states. You have one giant group of folks that are now no longer going to be German, French, Spanish, British, Nordic, Polish. It's all going to go into one giant pot. Maybe man is ready for that. Maybe man isn't ready for that. Maybe they're thinking, well, we're the courageous group of, elite, which are going to force this on people because we think it should all kind of melt together. We have to figure out what model of the universe / our planet that we want regionally. No American should be telling necessarily a German how they want to run their country. I'm sitting here saying I like the way that America is run. I like being American. America has been the melting pot for a very long time. We've been able to, by governing our immigration, make really good pockets of different races. Even where I'm living now, there are folks that complain about the migration and legal migration and legal purchase of land, homes and what have you, by certain races that come in and they take over neighborhoods. There's jokes that neighborhoods used to be white, now they're different. That happens all over this country. We have to decide how we're going to solve the issue. We have to try and make sure that we don't create contradicting policies to say, okay, well, we have simply open borders with China. Chinese people can move over here as much as they want. Any Asian country can move into America as much as they want. Oh, but the Mexicans are bad people. They can't move in. And it's really just the difference between financial capabilities. People in China are really steadfast about saving money and following the rules. And so they can come in and make it happen. Now, of course, there's always someone who's not following the rules. But, Mexico is very destitute as a country. And so they can't essentially save up this kind of money all the time. Maybe they can pay a coyote to get them across the border, but once they're here, they don't have the right paperwork. They don't speak the language, perhaps. And so they seem more of a quote-unquote invader than folks that take some time out to learn English and make sure when they move in here, they have a big enough bank account they can buy a home or rent an apartment. The general consensus here in the United States, as far as I've experienced, is that nobody wants to travel to Europe anymore. We don't want to go there anymore. And the reason is that we're not visiting what we have always built up in our mind to visit. I want to go to Germany, where I was born. I want to see the place as indigenous as possible when I go over there. I want to go to London and visit British history. And I want it to be as purely British as possible. Now, that's a selfish thought I have towards them. Now, as long as everyone in the EU is happy with this melting pot thing of taking on essentially an infinite influx of, say, Arabs in this particular case right now in 2017, then hey, we have to honor that from America. Europe will be the Middle East in a couple of years, or I should say 10 years. 10 years it'll be more than 51%, not the indigenous folks that gave the countries their names, that gave the countries their history, because no one's procreating. But the whole thing is based on the haves and the have-nots, right? More mental conditioning, more mental technology to make sure you feel like, well, if you're in Asia, you're missing out. And I have definitely talked to some folks that have come over here. They've spent 8 years trying to get their life together in America because they believed in all this freedom and what have you, and they ended up going back home and loving it. Loving being surrounded by people that have the same, cultures and food and rituals. They realize that, Vietnam's a gorgeous place physically. Gorgeous place physically. All those countries are gorgeous. And obviously America is gorgeous as well. But once you come to America, depending on where you land, and most of them land in big cities, it's dog eat dog. And at the immigration level, it is even more intense as they fight for jobs. What I want you to get out of this episode is the following. When you wake up, when you think, you are aware that every thought you have is based on what you've allowed into your mind as a rule set. Right now in 2017, there couldn't be a better time in your life to re-engineer the way that you think based on your preferences. But you need to check your preferences and how you got them before you go and re-engineer what's true, false, or maybe. And be courageous, be bold, be willing to go back to zero. And what does that mean? Well, if you're a Christian, you should be able to go back to zero and reinvent Christianity for yourself using things that are unequivocally true to you. And it could be, again, that you take back Christianity not because you believe that Jesus Christ was a real person, but because you believe that his overall message is better than it is bad. And that regardless of what people have said about him since his visit, if you believe he really existed, or even if you don't believe he existed, you think it's more valuable than to not have him in your life, to gain a moral fiber, right? I assure you that we all have controllers. We have the same controllers. Forget your boss, forget the CEO of the corporation you might work for. They're controllers, but they're so far down the totem pole, they're more of a symptom than a cause. Your true controllers are the cause of all of your dilemmas in life. Remember, the human mind and the human body is really not engineered for the amount of work that we do every single day. I watched personally as a kid in my 20s, moving up through corporation after corporation, the CEOs talking at length about how the workday was going to get longer and longer and longer, and that's how America was going to beat this sort of export notion of sending all of our jobs and production to China and India. In the end, we were suckers. It was sort of a Robin Hood formula to say, this is what's going to keep us on top. And in the end, we're incredibly stressed. The financial mechanisms that keep us poor are never ending. And I think that's why America voted for change. Something completely different. Hell, take a risk, for Christ's sake. Maybe our current leadership is not going to pan out, but at least we think someone's trying. I think you feel me. I'm really interested in your feedback on this, and I'm most interested in your comments that might relate to victories that you've had in your own indoctrination, where you were under a particular spell of propaganda or indoctrination, maybe perhaps related exactly to what I've been talking about, but probably even more interesting if you can come up with some ones that I completely missed. And just discuss and let us know, share with us, I was here for X number of years. I was here because of these circumstances of my upbringing, and this is where I heard something, woke up a certain way, saw something that couldn't be unseen, and you made changes. You had the courage to do it. And it doesn't have to be a gigantic shift to be incredibly important and valuable. But I think that by us listening to your victories, you're going to help the rest of us perhaps go down that path as well. Like I said in an episode a few back, imagine you make a comment and you change someone's life at 20 for their benefit. You give them more strength and more power because you shared a story at 60 years old that changed a 20-year-old. And that 20-year-old lives to be 100 years old. So you've modified for the betterment of mankind 80 years of a particular individual's life. And I think most of us know through basic math that that person will affect others. And so you'll be rebuilding with the rest of us society from the bottom up. Everyone knows that the bankers of the world don't really give a shit about money. They've got infinite cash. That's not the problem. They want control. They're getting off on modifying us to making us their slaves. They love it. They love it, man. And what's really interesting is most of us, when I talk about those type of oligarchy bankers, we think about it being a gigantic cabal over the whole planet, right? Well, that's true. But I'll tell you that you can run into a rich person and they will try to do that to you on a micro level. So the disease spreads all the way down to normal man. I think there's a lot of homeless people in the world that have maintained their sanity, and in their mind, if you interview them, they're like, well, I'd much rather be in control of my life and broke and destitute and homeless than to be under the gun and manipulation and abuse of another human being. Right? There's a lot of divorces that happen that way, right? Where one of the spouses is being a jerk on a really epic level and they escape. And they'll tell you, look, I used to be in a home where everything was taken care of, and now I, struggle to pay rent. But you know what? I'm happy. I'm not being controlled. DeepThoughtsRadio.com for all the feeds. There's video if you're on audio if you're on video. Your video choices are YouTube.com and vid.me. Your audio choices are iTunes, Google Play, or just simply go to DeepThoughtsRadio.com on your mobile device. Make sure you have a podcast reader installed. Hit the icon in the lower right, which is the podcast feed, and it will automatically link to your device, and you'll have everything in your car. Thanks for joining. I super appreciate it. Welcome to all the newcomers. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I will see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.